The real reason everyone got married in Britain. Today, we are accustomed to viewing marriage as the ultimate culmination of a romantic journey. We search for a soulmate based on feelings, shared interests, and chemistry. However, if we transport ourselves back to Britain in the 18th, 19th, and even the early 20th centuries, we discover that the concept of love in marriage was not just secondary. It was often regarded as a dangerous form of frivolity. For centuries, Britons entered into marriage for reasons that would strike us today as cynical, frightening, and even heartless. It was not a story of romance, but a saga of survival, the transfer of property, and social control. To understand why people truly walked down the aisle in Old Blighty, we have to look past the white veils and see the cold, hard machinery of the British class system and the law. For the British upper and middle classes up until the mid-20th century, a marriage was effectively the historical equivalent of a modern-day corporate merger. Love was considered a temporary madness that should never be allowed to interfere with serious business. The primary engine of marriage was the preservation and consolidation of land and titles. Under the British legal system of primogeniture, the eldest son inherited everything, leaving younger sons and daughters to fend for themselves. Marriage was the only way for a woman to secure her future and for a man to fortify his social standing. The marriage settlements of the time were massive, multi-page legal documents where lawyers meticulously debated how much pin money, personal allowance, a wife would receive and what portion of her dowry would return to her original family if her husband died. In a world without state pensions or social safety nets, marriage was the ultimate financial insurance policy. This necessity was even more stark for women due to the shocking legal principle known as coverture. Under this doctrine, once a woman married, her legal identity was literally absorbed into that of her husband. She could not own property in her own name, she could not sign contracts, and every penny she earned legally belonged to her spouse. One might wonder why any woman would voluntarily enter such a state of legal servitude. The answer was simple. In Britain, the status of a spinster was a social death sentence. A woman without a husband and without a wealthy father was utterly defenseless and often destitute. Marriage was the only legal way to gain a roof over one's head and protection, even at the cost of one's civil rights. It was a transaction where a woman traded her freedom for economic security. However, the pressure to marry wasn't just about money. It was about the crushing weight of reputation. Before the sexual revolution of the 1960s, sex outside of marriage was socially ruinous, particularly for women. Yet history reveals that the British were not as puritanical as they seemed. Shocking statistics from the 19th century suggest that in some rural English parishes, up to 30% of brides were already pregnant when they reached the altar. But this was rarely an act of liberation. It was the result of the shotgun wedding, a social phenomenon driven not by morality, but by taxes. Local parishes did not want to support illegitimate children using taxpayers' money. Marriage was a tool used by the community to shift the financial burden of a child from the state onto a specific man. People were forced into marriage to ensure that the poor did not breed the poor at the expense of the public purse. In the industrial heartlands like Manchester or Birmingham, marriage served a different but equally pragmatic purpose: the formation of a family production unit. In an era before household appliances, surviving alone was a physical impossibility, A man needed a wife to prepare food, mend clothes, and manage the home during the 12 to 14 hours he spent on the factory floor. Conversely, a woman needed a husband as the primary provider of calories. A single man in the working-class slums would quickly decline and die from disease and poor nutrition, while a single woman was often doomed to backbreaking labor for pittance or forced into the shadows of society. Marriage in the working class was a union of two labor resources to minimize the costs of housing and food. During the Victorian era, marriage further evolved into a tool of social control. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert cultivated an image of the ideal family that was broadcast as a standard of civic duty. If a man remained unmarried by the age of 30, he was viewed with deep suspicion. He might be considered politically unreliable, morally unstable, or odd, a term that in those days could hint at then criminalized homosexuality. Marriage was a certificate of normalcy. Without a wedding ring, the career ladders in politics, law, or the church were effectively blocked. People married simply to earn the right to be called full members of society. Perhaps the darkest reason for marriage was the pervasive fear of the workhouse. Until the introduction of the welfare state in the 1940s, a person who lost the ability to work and had no family to support them often ended their days in the horrific conditions of the workhouse, where families were forcibly separated and inmates were subjected to grueling labor and starvation diets. In this context, children were viewed as a retirement plan. The more children a marriage produced, the higher the chance that one of them could provide a home for the parents in their old age. People entered marriage and raised large families out of a biological and economic calculation. It was the only way to avoid dying in a ditch when their hands could no longer hold a plow or a spindle. This calculated approach to marriage was reinforced by the fact that for a long time there was no way out. Until 1857, divorce in England was virtually impossible for anyone but the ultra-wealthy, requiring a specific Act of Parliament that cost an astronomical sum. This led to the shocking and desperate practice of wife-selling among the poor. While not legally valid, a husband would lead his wife to market on a halter and sell her to another man, often by prior arrangement, which the community accepted as a legitimate break. Knowing that marriage was a deal until death forced people to be guided by cold logic rather than fleeting passion. The eventual collapse of marriage by necessity was not brought about by romantic poetry, but by the economic shifts of the two world wars. When women began working in factories en masse and earning their own wages, the foundation of economic dependency cracked. This was followed by the birth of the welfare state in 1948. The introduction of pensions and universal health care meant that people no longer needed to marry and have 10 children just to survive their senior years. Marriage transformed from a survival mechanism into a luxury based on personal choice. When we look back at this hidden history, we realize that for our ancestors, the altar was not a place for romantic vows, but the site of the most important contract of their lives. We are among the first generations in British history who can afford to marry for no reason at all. Our predecessors would look at our focus on spark and chemistry with utter bewilderment, for their marriages were built on the far sturdier, if grimmer, foundations of survival, property, and law. This has been a deep dive into the real reasons behind the British obsession with marriage. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden side of history, be sure to subscribe to my channel.